Have you ever wondered how people in the Middle Ages kept food from spoiling, long before refrigerators and preservatives existed? While we worry about expiry dates on milk and bread today, medieval peasants, monks, and nobles relied on clever methods and a few surprising foods that seemed almost immortal. Honey that never spoiled, fish salted to last through long winters, and beans that could outlive bad harvests. These weren't luxuries. They were survival. In this video, we'll take a slow journey into the forgotten pantries of medieval Europe. You'll discover the simple, often boring, but ingenious ways people stockpiled food to endure famine, war, and harsh winters. And as you listen, you may begin to notice how many of these ancient survival secrets still sit quietly in our kitchens today. So settle in, relax, and let's open the cellar door to a world of food that never went bad. Chapter 1: Golden Preservation. In the medieval world, if you lived in a medieval village, surrounded by thatched cottages, tilled fields, and the ever-present cycle of hunger and harvest, you would likely have thought about food in a way far more serious than we do today. For you, survival depended on the delicate balance of what could be grown, stored, and consumed before it spoiled. Without refrigeration, every perishable was a gamble, every crop vulnerable to weather, and every winter a long test of endurance. Yet one substance stood out from the rest. One food seemed immune to time, an almost miraculous offering from nature itself. Honey. Honey was not simply a sweet treat. It was, quite literally, one of the few foods that could be stored indefinitely, without spoiling. Medieval households, monasteries, and royal kitchens alike regarded honey as both treasure and necessity. To understand why honey endured in their pantries for years or even decades, you have to imagine the science and daily life behind it. When bees gather nectar, they begin a natural process of evaporation and enzyme activity. By the time nectar becomes honey, it has so little water content and such high sugar concentration that bacteria and molds cannot survive in it. This simple yet remarkable fact meant that a sealed jar of honey could remain edible centuries later. Archaeologists have even discovered honey in Egyptian tombs, still golden and still sweet after thousands of years. Medieval people didn't need microscopes to know that honey lasted. They simply observed it, preserved it, and relied on it. But honey was more than food. In medieval Europe, it was also medicine, a preservative, a trade commodity, and even a religious symbol. A monk in a cloistered garden might stir honey into herbal concoctions, confident in its healing power. A housewife in a peasant cottage might mix honey with vinegar to pickle vegetables, knowing the combination kept food from rotting. A royal cook might drizzle honey over roasted meats, not only for flavor, but also because it helped preserve the dish longer when stored. Honey's uses were wide-ranging, and because it was so durable, it became an anchor of survival. In the early medieval period, long before the widespread introduction of cane sugar to Europe, honey was the only common sweetener available. This made it incredibly valuable. Imagine your daily diet consisting largely of grains, coarse bread, pottage, a kind of thick stew, and salted fish. Honey transformed meals into something memorable. It could be mixed into bread dough, poured over porridge, or stirred into ale. Sweetness was rare, and honey was its main source. To secure it, medieval people often relied on beekeeping, a practice as old as civilization itself. Beekeepers managed hives made from woven wicker, clay, or hollowed logs. Tending bees required patience and courage, as protective gear was limited to simple veils or smoke. The honey harvest, often in late summer, was a significant event in village life. Families would gather to help, and the wax, equally prized, was saved for candles. These candles lit not only homes but also churches, creating a connection between honey and the sacred. The religious significance of honey cannot be overlooked. In Christian Europe, honey was associated with abundance and divine blessing. Monasteries in particular became centers of beekeeping. Monks tended hives not only to supply their kitchens, but also to provide wax for the vast numbers of candles needed in churches. Honey thus connected the rhythms of rural labor to the glow of holy rituals. Yet, despite its enduring qualities, honey's role in survival was not limitless. While it could be stored indefinitely, how much honey a family or community had depended on access to hives, trade routes, and the labor to collect it. Some peasants might only taste honey a few times a year, if at all. For wealthier households, honey flowed more freely, mixed into sauces, glazes, and desserts. This uneven access reminds us that honey was not only nature's gift, but also a reflection of medieval society's hierarchy. Still, the presence of honey in pantries and storerooms represented stability in an uncertain world. Unlike milk, which soured in a day, or fresh vegetables, which wilted within a week, honey seemed eternal. In times of famine, when grain supplies ran low and salted meat dwindled, honey remained a reliable source of calories. This permanence gave it a place of respect, almost reverence, in medieval life, and yet, honey was only one of many foods medieval people learned to preserve against time. Their ingenuity with preservation techniques went far beyond the sweetness of bees. They salted fish until it was hard as wood, smoked meats until they carried the flavor of fire, and stored root vegetables deep in the earth where frost could not reach them. But even among this pantry of preserved goods, honey remained unique. So, as you picture the medieval pantry, clay jars sealed with wax, wooden barrels of salted herring, sacks of dried beans, and wheels of hard cheese, think of honey as the golden constant, the one food you could trust to endure through winter and beyond. And this leads us to a deeper question. Honey lasted forever, but it was far from abundant. What foods then did ordinary medieval peasants rely on when honey was too rare or expensive to fill their needs? Chapter 2: Salted Fish and the Trade That Preserved Europe. If honey was nature's miracle, requiring little more than bees and patience, then salted fish was humanity's invention, born of necessity and careful labor. To understand medieval life, you must imagine how central fish, preserved by salt, was to the survival of people across Europe. Without refrigeration, fresh fish spoiled quickly, often within a day. But when rubbed with salt, layered in barrels, or dried by sea winds, fish could last not days but months, even years. This process transformed a perishable into a staple. Salted fish was not just food. It was a foundation of the medieval economy. In fact, one might argue that Europe's very survival was tethered to barrels of preserved herring, cod, and other species. These stores of protein nourished peasants in landlocked villages, monks in secluded monasteries, and kings in their stone castles alike. But how exactly did this salty preservation work, and why did it become so widespread? The science of preservation. Salt is life insurance. Salt has the remarkable ability to draw out moisture from flesh. When fish were gutted and packed in layers of salt, the brine created by this process prevented the growth of bacteria. The result was not exactly fresh, and not necessarily delicious by modern standards, but it was safe, filling, and long-lasting. For medieval households, this meant security. A peasant farmer who might starve during a failed harvest could look to a cask of salted herring as sustenance through the cold months. A merchant's caravan could carry salted fish hundreds of miles inland without fear of spoilage. For monasteries, where strict fasting rules forbade meat on many days of the year, salted fish was a dietary cornerstone. The Catholic calendar required abstaining from meat for over 100 days annually, including every Friday and during Lent. Fish, however, was permitted. Thus, the demand for preserved fish skyrocketed. Entire industries emerged to meet this religious necessity. The link between salt, fish, and faith shaped trade routes, economies, and diets across medieval Europe. Herring and cod, the staples of survival. Two species dominated medieval pantries: herring and cod. herring was abundant in the cold waters of the North and Baltic Seas. During spawning seasons, schools of herring were so vast that chroniclers described the sea as boiling with fish. These seasonal harvests became the lifeblood of medieval trade. Fishermen caught herring by the thousands, gutted them on shore, salted them in barrels, and exported them inland. Cod, on the other hand, became especially significant in the later Middle Ages. The waters of the North Atlantic teemed with cod, and once dried in the cold winds of Norway or Iceland, it hardened into a tough, lightweight plank known as stockfish. Stockfish could last for years if kept dry, making it the perfect trade commodity. Unlike herring, which was oily and required heavy salting, cod was lean and dried easily. For many inland Europeans, stockfish was their first and often only taste of the sea. Both herring and cod were not merely foods but currencies of survival. Wars were fought, treaties signed, and towns built on the wealth of fish, salt roads, and trade networks. The importance of salted fish cannot be understood without mentioning salt itself. Salt was so vital that entire roads were built for its trade. The so-called salt roads. Towns like Lüneburg in Germany grew wealthy from their salt mines, exporting this white gold to preserve herring along the Baltic coast. Without salt, the fish trade collapsed. Without fish, Europe's food security faltered. Consider the Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of merchant cities in Northern Europe. Its influence in the 13th and 14th centuries came not from luxury goods, but from control over herring, fisheries, and salt routes. The League's ships carried barrels of salted fish across the Baltic and North Seas, feeding cities from London to Novgorod. This was not glamorous trade, but it was essential. For coastal villages, salted fish was livelihood. For inland peasants, it was survival. The balance of salt, sea, and trade created a web that stretched across Europe, binding its economy to something as unassuming as a salted fillet. Everyday life with salted fish for the medieval household. Salted fish was common fare. Peasants might stew it with onions or add it to pottage for flavor. Wealthier families might soak the fish in wine or vinegar to soften its hardness before cooking it with spices. While fresh meat was scarce and often expensive, salted fish provided a steady protein source accessible to many. It was, however, monotonous. Chronicles and records suggest that many complained about the blandness of salted fish, especially during the long fasting seasons when it became the default meal. Yet complaints did little to change its centrality. Survival mattered more than taste. Salted fish also carried symbolic weight. For monks, eating fish reflected humility and obedience to the rules of fasting. For merchants, barrels of herring represented profit and prosperity. For peasants, salted fish in the pantry meant peace of mind during the lean months of winter. The hidden costs of preservation. Despite its ubiquity, salted fish came with costs. Salt itself was expensive, and controlling its trade gave certain regions immense power. The process of salting and drying required labor, organization, and access to coastal resources, which not all communities had. Inland peasants often paid dearly for the fish that reached their markets. There were also health considerations. A diet heavy in salted foods, without sufficient fresh produce, contributed to ailments we would now recognize as nutritional deficiencies. Yet in the medieval mindset, survival outweighed variety. Salted fish, though unglamorous, was indispensable. Its endurance in the medieval pantry reveals much about human ingenuity, resource management, and the influence of religion on diet. The barrel of herring in a cellar was not just a food item. It was security against hunger and a reflection of Europe's interconnected trade. But salted fish was only one answer to the great problem of preservation. Other foods, vegetables, herbs, and meats found longevity through different means. And perhaps most surprisingly, even in a world without refrigeration, medieval people discovered that some humble legumes and grains could last for years when stored properly. So here's the question: After honey and salted fish, what role did simple dried foods like beans and peas play in sustaining medieval households through famine and scarcity? Chapter 3. Dried beans and the long shelf life of legumes. If honey was sweetness preserved in amber and salted fish was survival sealed in barrels, then beans and legumes were the quiet, dependable backbone of medieval storage. They lacked glamour. They did not sparkle like honey in sunlight or create bustling markets like herring on the Baltic coast. Yet their persistence in storerooms and cellars across Europe speaks volumes about how medieval people endured scarcity. The humble bean inn. The medieval pantry. Beans, peas, chickpeas, and lentils were among the most reliable foods medieval people could count on. They were easy to dry, store, and transport. Once dried, legumes could last not just a season, but several years, provided they were kept away from dampness, rodents, and insects, unlike meat or fish, which required preservation through salting, smoking, or drying. Beans required no additives. They could be harvested in the autumn, left to dry naturally in the air, and stored in sacks or ceramic jars. When hunger struck months later, they could be soaked, boiled, and transformed into stews, porridges, or breads mixed with flour. For peasants, this was invaluable. Even when crops failed, a few sacks of beans in the loft could sustain a household. They were inexpensive compared to meat or even salted fish, which meant they were accessible to the poor. In many ways, beans were famine insurance. A diet of peas and pottage, the medieval staple dish, pottage, often included beans or peas. Pottage was essentially a thick soup, a catch-all for whatever ingredients were available. Grains, onions, herbs, sometimes a little meat or fish, but more often beans and peas. For the poor, pottage was eaten daily. Chroniclers note that peasants sometimes consumed peas and beans so frequently that they became synonymous with their diets. In England, records from monasteries and manorial accounts show enormous quantities of dried peas stored for winter months. A single abbey might keep tons of dried peas to feed its monks and visitors throughout the year. Beans also had symbolic weight. In medieval Europe, eating legumes was often associated with humility and simplicity, in contrast to the feasts of nobles filled with fresh meats and exotic spices. The bean became the food of the common man, both sustaining and grounding. The science of shelf life. Why did beans last so long? Their secret lies in their low moisture content once dried. Without water, bacteria and mold struggled to grow. Kept dry and sealed, beans could remain edible for years, though they hardened over time and required long boiling to soften. Archaeologists have even uncovered dried beans from centuries past that, though not palatable, remain identifiable and intact. For medieval people, this resilience was not a curiosity. It was a lifeline. Grain could spoil if damp or infested with weevils. Meat without preservation rotted quickly. But beans, properly stored, simply waited, patient in their sacks, until hunger returned them to the pot. Peasants, monks, and nobles alike. While peas and beans were often associated with peasants, they were not absent from noble diets. During fasting days, when meat and dairy were prohibited, beans and legumes offered protein alternatives. Monks especially relied on legumes, combining them with bread and beer to sustain their strict lifestyles. The aristocracy, meanwhile, did not disdain legumes entirely. Records from noble households show that while their tables featured venison, roasted fowl, and fresh fish, they too kept beans and peas in storage. These served not only as emergency supplies, but also as ingredients in more refined dishes, often cooked with spices or served alongside meats. The universality of legumes underscores their value. Unlike honey, which could be rare and expensive, or salted fish, which required access to coasts and trade, beans were democratic. Every village could grow them. Every household could store them. Every stomach could be filled by them. The broader impact of dried foods, beans and legumes, in their simplicity, reveal something profound about medieval resilience. They remind us that survival was not just about trade leagues or bustling markets, but about ordinary families planting and drying crops that would sustain them in lean times. This reliance on dried legumes also shaped agricultural cycles. Farmers planted fields of peas or beans not only for food, but also because these plants enriched the soil with nitrogen. Thus, legumes contributed to the fertility of medieval farmland, sustaining both people and the earth itself. In this way, beans were not just food but part of a larger ecological system. They provided nourishment, improved the soil, and could be traded or stored. Their endurance through centuries explains why they remain staples today. From lentil soups to chickpea stews, the quiet power of beans, unlike honey or salted fish. Beans did not inspire poetry or dominate international trade routes, yet they were there in the background, filling bellies when harvests failed, sustaining monks during fasts, and giving peasants the strength to labor in the fields. To the medieval mind, beans might not have been glamorous, but they were trustworthy. They represented certainty in a world full of uncertainty, a humble sack of security resting in the corner of a storeroom. And so we return to a broader question. If honey, salted fish, and dried beans provided the foundation for medieval survival, what other foods were hidden in their pantries, patiently resisting decay? From vinegar to hard cheeses, smoked meats to dried fruits, medieval ingenuity found countless ways to cheat spoilage. Reflection. Honey taught us that nature itself sometimes offered eternal sweetness. Salted fish revealed the power of trade, faith, and preservation. And beans showed us that the simplest foods could be the most enduring of all together. They form a portrait of a medieval world not dominated by kings and knights, but by the quiet, practical struggle to store food and outlast hunger. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me, exploring the forgotten foods that once kept medieval people alive. I hope this little journey through history has helped you feel calm, relaxed, and maybe even a little sleepy. If you enjoyed this story and would like more calm and boring history to fall asleep to, please remember to like this video and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. Your support helps me keep making these slow, gentle stories just for you. Until next time, may your night be peaceful, and may you drift into rest with the quiet comfort of history by your side. Good night.